Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Simon Martinelli and welcome to my talk about jOOQ. I will do a deep dive for the next 3 hours. So that doesn't mean that I will talk for 3 hours because we will have a break in the middle of about half an hour that you can get some coffee. First, some words about myself. Hello. Sorry. I'm working in the software industry for around 28 years now. I started with COBOL, as you can see, and also SQL. So SQL is something that I do for a very long time. I later on moved to Java. And I'm a teacher at two universities in Switzerland. I'm living in Switzerland. That's also where my ugly accents come from. And I have my own company and I'm working as an independent consultant for 15 years now. I'm also in the Java user group. So if you're in Switzerland and want to see some Java content, go to jOOQ.ch, or if you're a speaker and like to speak in Switzerland as well, just go there or contact me after the talk or in the break. We will be happy to host you. Let's have a look at the topics. Here you can see in the middle it's called jOOQ Workshop. That's because the slides and also the code that I will show you is from a jOOQ workshop that I usually do. And instead of you doing the exercises, I will do the exercises for you during the next time. So the topics that we will have a look at is, first we will have a look at the setup, what we need to run jOOQ to execute our SQL statements. Then we will have a look into code generation because jOOQ heavily relies on code generation. Then we do have a look how we can create SQL statements with jOOQ. Finally, we need to execute them to get some results, and then we will see how we get the results, what we can do with the results, and then will be a lot of other topics that we may or may not cover. We will see how far it will go during the deep dive. So if you have any questions, just ask. I will try to either answer them immediately or postpone it to a later time if it also part of the content. And we have some example code. So if you use this QR code here or go to this GitHub site, you will find the code. And if you have your notebook with you, you can follow me also in the code or have a look at the code, run it yourself. So this should work without any problems. So wait that everybody could take a picture. Fine. So now let's move a step back. Move back to 1995. You know, in 1995, Java was introduced, and a few years later, something like this was introduced. The code looks very blurry because it's very old. That's the reason. Has anybody of you seen that in the wild? 1, 2, 3, 4? Wow, that's not bad. That's called embedded SQL. Or SQL. I usually use SQL, by the way. In German, I would say SQL, because German is the language that I usually speak normally. Now, during that talk, I will talk about SQL, and this is called embedded SQL. So here on top, you can see that you have a SQL statement, and that's directly in your Java file. So with this hash SQL there, this introduces this embedded SQL. And if you go down, you see for this on top, it's something like a cursor, we could say. And down there in the while loop, we have a fetch statement. And all the things that is prefixed with a double point is called a host variable. That means that that's the place where the data is fetched into. And this will then be later on compiled to something that may be familiar. It's a prepared statement with standard JDBC code. This embedded SQL ID came also from COBOL or from all the other mainframe or C or other old languages. And what this type of ID requires is kind of a SQL processor or a precompiler. And with Java, it was like that. You had this Java file. It has the ending SQLJ. And then you had this, here it's called SQL translator, that produces a Java file. And later on, it will compile to class file and you will execute it. Here, this picture is from DB2 from IBM. And DB2, I think it's still the same, also generates an execution plan already for your SQL statements during compile time. And that's what's happening with this .c files that were used to do that there. But we will not talk about embedded SQL, but we will talk about something similar, because we will talk about jOOQ. jOOQ or jOOQ. That's from the website, and it says it generates Java code from your database and lets you build type-safe SQL queries through a fluent API. So that means jOOQ has two parts. It generates something, and you have a domain-specific language that you can use to execute SQL. So that's it. So you can go now. You know everything that you need to know about jOOQ, and start with it. Thank you. So why should you use jOOQ? Lukas Eder, by the way, is a friend of mine. He's also from Switzerland, but I'm living in the western part of Switzerland. He's living in the eastern part, so we have like 3 hours ride to meet each other. But what he said is his idea is that SQL is never meant to be abstracted. So that means you should use SQL directly. He also said that it's never meant to be object-oriented or however, and it should stay SQL. So that's his point, and that's why he built something that you can use SQL in just a little way, as we saw before with this embedded SQL, just in plain Java. Now, before we start, what are some typical use cases for SQL? I use SQL in every project I can. You will see how you can use it, how you can combine it with other persistent solutions, but I usually use it for everything. So the point is, you can have this type-safe database object referencing. What does that mean? That means that you don't have to write SQL in strings. And now we have Java with text blocks, and we will get, or we already got, string templates that may be also used for that kind of job. But the point is, these are still strings. So strings are not compiled, so they are probably checked at runtime and not at compile time. But here we have something that is checked on compile time. Database object referencing not only means doing selects from tables, but there are a lot of other objects in the database. So you can have functions, store procedures, you can have user-defined types, and so on. And all of these objects you can access through jOOQ. So that's something that's usually not easy to do. So accessing store procedures with plain JDBC is not a funny thing to do, so this will become much easier using jOOQ with it. I know store procedures are not that common anymore in these days, but at least I have a customer where all the business logic of the ERP system is still in the Oracle database. So we will see also that, how easy it is to use store procedures with jOOQ. Then we want to have type-safe SQL construction. That means we need an API that we only can write valid SQL. So if you write SQL in strings, you can do whatever you want. So you will probably see at runtime, or hopefully you have a test that checks if your query runs, but you can write something that really doesn't work. And here we have a domain-specific language for that. And the great thing about this domain-specific language, because it sits on top of SQL, this means that you don't have to care about what database you use under the hood. Because if you are using jOOQ, you are also database agnostic. That means you can run your jOOQ code on Postgres or MariaDB or Oracle, and jOOQ will take care of the differences in the details about executing the SQL statement for you. So you have the same convenience as you have if you use Hibernate, for example. So you have someone who takes care about the SQL dialect. There is also the idea that you can mix. For example, you could use Hibernate to query, and you could use jOOQ. You could use Hibernate to do CRUD. So you can, for example, read, update, and delete. You will do through Hibernate to the object model, and you could use jOOQ to create the SQL statements. We will see how this integration will work. Or you can use it to do SQL execution. You can even use it together with Spring Data. I will show you also how to combine or to configure jOOQ with various frameworks. And you could use jOOQ without code generation. But that's the last statement you can forget. Don't do that. So it doesn't. It's not a good idea. But I will show you what I mean about that. Now the question is, because most of my customers are using Hibernate, so the first choice if someone starts a new Java project and needs to access a SQL database, he just uses JPA and most of the time Hibernate under the hood. But maybe you should think about your application and what you want to do with the application. And here in the manual from Lukas, there is also a section that describes two approaches. One approach is the traditional object-oriented mapping. So you have kind of, or what's called entity state transition. That means you read an entity, or if you do domain-driven design, you would read an aggregate root. Then you would execute some methods on the entities, and they will change the state of your entity or of your entity tree. And finally, you say Hibernate store that, and Hibernate will check what has changed and will do the update, delete, or whatever SQL statements has to be executed. But if you're working with a SQL database, you could also think in a data set transformation way. That means that you read the data set, you do something with that, and you store it back to the database. So this may sound a bit unclear. A good example is if you have a simple business application, what most of the time are you doing with the data? You very often have a table, you display the table to the user selects a row in the table, edits the data in a form, hits saves, and the data is stored back to the database. And exactly for that use case, that is data set transformation and not entity state transition, because usually in that type of business applications, there is very little business logic. Most of the logic that you have there is about validating the data. So, for example, if the email that is entered in the email field is a valid email address, for example. But there is very often not a lot of business logic. We will see an example of such an application later, and then maybe it will be clear what I mean about that. But if you have this type of applications that doing this data set transformation, you often also don't need relations in the object model between the different tables. I mean, in the database, you have relations, right? You have foreign keys. If you have a many-to-many relationship, you need a specific database table to hold the keys for this many-to-many relationship. But very often in the application, you don't need that relation. So it doesn't make sense to map, for example, with Hibernate every relation. This may also lead to some problems if you're using Hibernate. I will not talk about that today. But maybe there is a better solution, and we will see how this could work. Now, one question that I often get is, does jOOQ scale? Because, you know, the examples that I will show you, also the application, are very tiny examples, so with a handful of database tables. But the point is, jOOQ scales because jOOQ is exactly made for that. So jOOQ was initially created for a Swiss bank, and they had a huge database model with thousands of tables, stored procedures, and stuff like that. And it was practically impossible to use Hibernate for that, because you don't want to map thousands or 2,000 or 3,000 entities with Hibernate. And so that was the inspiration or the start for the creation of jOOQ at all. In my case, I have a customer application that is an ERP product that's very old already. It's about 35 years old. And they have around 2,000 tables and views. And as I already said, they have all the business logic in store procedures and functions. These are around the 5,000. So, and you will see with jOOQ, this is not a bad thing, by the way. It's just a different programming language, and it runs in the database and not in your application layer. But you will see that it's very easy to use. Now, the second question that I often get is jOOQ free? Because if you go to the website, then you see something like that, right? So you have an sorry, you don't see that. Let's switch here. Because you see an open source version, an express version, a professional, and an enterprise version. Why that? First of all, the open source version is more or less a bit reduced in the feature set, and you have to use the latest version of an open source database. That are the restrictions. But I can tell you from my experience with the open source version, you can build just any application you need. Because all the rest that is added by the other versions are very specific things if you do heavily rely on the database functionality, for example. That's very important. Now the question is, why is jOOQ not free at all? The point is, jOOQ is one of the examples of an open source project where the creator of the open source project can make a living of open source. Because usually if you use open source like Hibernate or use open source like Spring, then this is completely free. But the point is that the people that are creating these open source frameworks are paid from a company that makes money in another way. So if you want to make money just from open source, and then you can do something like that. And there is also in the blog, there's a blog that is very highly recommended to read or to have a look at. There is also a blog post about how you can start an open source project and get a business out of it. But you know, usually that's not a problem, because if you look at the prices and you have an Oracle database, you can compare the prices from jOOQ and the Oracle database. That's just money for nothing. But the point is, what you will get if you have one of the paid versions is you get a lot of support for other databases, for example. So I would say more or less on this list is every SQL database that currently exists that you can use with it. And because jOOQ has integrated all these databases, probably Lukas is the only person in the world who knows all the database types and how they work at the end. So that's the point about that. Now let's have a look at jOOQ and how the architecture looks like. On top you see this jOOQ DSL. That's a domain-specific language. That's just SQL in Java, more or less. So there are some restrictions because we are using Java, or we will use Java. That's also where the J comes from in the name of jOOQ. But there is also extensions for Scala and Kotlin. So if you're using Kotlin or Scala, you may have a slightly different way of working or programming, and that there also jOOQ has you covered. So you can use jOOQ with that. The examples will be with Java today, so I will not show you Kotlin or Java or Scala code. Then on the lower side, we see a database, and we see a jOOQ generator that is generated Java classes. Now, we will see where this database comes from, because this could be a problem. So do you have a database that you can use to generate code, and will the code then match all databases you have on your stages, for example? And also the question is, from what is generating the generator? The Java classes, is it really a database, or may it also be some DDL scripts or something like that? We will see that. Now, if you want to start, you can go to jOOQ.org. For sure, you will find the documentation. That is really good. And there is also a demo project on GitHub. The code from the demo project is also integrated in my example code, by the way. So I copied that for you, that you can see how this works, and also that you will get a lot more examples than just the exercises that we will do. Now first, let's have a look at the setup. And we are using a schema that, has anybody already heard about Sakila, by the way? Some people, yeah. Sakila was originally the demo schema of MySQL database. So it's a movie rental store application. So it's maybe a very outdated example. By the way, who of you rented films on cassettes back in the days? Oh, the majority, that's fine. So we will understand the model, that's great. So what we had back then, we had like stores where you can go, and then there were films on this VHS cassettes that you can rent and take home, and then you can watch the movie and bring it back. So Netflix before Netflix, something like that. And here in the model, just to have an understanding, we have the big table there in more or less on the center. That's a film. So the film has a lot of columns like description, when it was released, stuff like that. And then the films are categorized. So we have a many-to-many relationship because between a film category and the film, because a film could fit into multiple categories. So that's why we have this relationship table there, the film category. Then we need some actors. So there are usually actors in a film. There we also have a many-to-many relationship because an actor usually doesn't play only in one film. We have a language, and then that's our film part. On the other hand, we have stores. So a store has an inventory. That means not every store has the same inventory. So maybe some store only has a certain type of films. And in the store, we also have staff that is working there. Then we have on the lower side, on the right side, we have the customer. The customer has an address with the city and the country. The customer usually goes to a store and rents a film. That creates a rental and a payment, and there's usually stuff involved that helps the customer to rent the movie. So that's the database schema that we are using. I think it's quite a good one. The good thing about that is it is originally made by MySQL. So if you go to mysql.org, for example, you still can download the original Sakila. But what Lukas did, he created a version of Sakila for many different databases. Let's have a look. I don't even know how many he did. So there is a GitHub project, and we have Cockroach, DB2, MySQL, Oracle, Postgres, SQL Server, SQLite, and Yugabyte. So we have like a variety of databases that are supported where you can use that. Now, if you want to use jOOQ, you just need a database connection. So you don't need any framework to use jOOQ, because jOOQ is just on top of JDBC, and if you have a JDBC connection, you can use jOOQ. But for sure, there are framework integrations. For example, there is a starter for Spring Boot. And if you go to start.spring.io, for example, you can search for jOOQ, and then you will find the start jOOQ access layer. What does it do? With the jOOQ starter for Spring Boot, by the way, who is using Spring Boot? Who is using Quarkus? Who is using Java EE or Jakarta EE directly without any framework? Okay. So with the jOOQ Spring Boot starter, you will get integration that you will get the DSL context. We will see what this class is. You can inject that. And all the configuration about data source and stuff like that will be done by Spring. You can also configure jOOQ in a Spring way, so you can create a customizer, and then it will create the configuration for you. And the same you also have for Quarkus. Here with Quarkus, if you have a look at the extensions, then you can also search for jOOQ, and here you find also jOOQ as an extension for Quarkus. This extension does the same as with Spring Boot. So you can use the default Quarkus data source inside your jOOQ context. So that's more or less doing the same thing. Other than that, it's very easy to configure jOOQ, so it doesn't really rely on a framework. In my presentation, I will use Maven. Why do I use Maven? Or another question, who is using Maven? Who is using Gradle? The reason why I'm using Maven is because the plugin is a Maven plugin. So the officially created plugin for jOOQ that generates the code that we will see is for Maven. There is also a Gradle plugin. The Gradle plugin is made by Gradle. So I don't know who created it, but someone from Gradle. And you also have support for that. The problem is, if you use the Gradle plugin, it may not be, when a new version of jOOQ comes out and it changed something in the generator, you have to wait a while until the Gradle plugin is adapted. But there is a feature request for jOOQ, and I think they are working together to integrate also the Gradle plugin into jOOQ. I use Spring Boot because I usually use Spring Boot, and I use TestContainers in the demo. I will talk about that in a minute, and I use PostgreSQL. That's my favorite database, but that's not the database I usually use. Usually I use Oracle because most of my customers are large companies in Switzerland, and they more or less use all Oracle. I also have some Azure SQL customers in the meanwhile. So a lot of companies in Switzerland are moving to Azure Cloud with their applications, and they usually choose Azure SQL. And some of them are using still MariaDB or MySQL, but mostly I use Oracle, or in all my projects where I can decide which database to use, I use Postgres. But for what we will do in the next minute, it really doesn't matter. You can use any database with jOOQ. It's not so important. But it may differ in some functionality. For example, lately what a lot of databases have added, for example, is JSON support. So not only that you can read JSON or XML already for 25 years. So I think, let me think, Oracle introduced XML support in the late 90s, and JSON more or less when it came out. And Postgres also has JSON support to read data, so there are JSON or XML functions. But what we get lately is also we can use, for example, JSON paths to do queries, and we can check if in a text column, for example, if the JSON is valid or not. So PostgreSQL added that functionality in the latest version, in 16. Oracle had that already for quite a while. And why I'm talking about that, we will see a feature of jOOQ that is using JSON behind the scene. That's important. And sometimes if you have an older version of a database, for example, an older version of MariaDB, they don't support some features, then you may get, anyway, despite that I told you that jOOQ will abstract the database, you can run into problems if you're doing certain types of queries. But that's very, very rare, and these are all very special cases. Now, test containers. Who of you is using test containers? Less than half, because they had just a survey, and they announced that 50% of all developers are using test containers, so that's not entirely true, as I can see. In my opinion, test containers for testing applications is the best thing that happened since Docker or containers were invented, because it makes it very easy to run any thing in a container. For our case, we need databases in a container, and that's great. And that's also a reason why I use Postgres, because Postgres starts extremely fast. So starting a Postgres database takes a few milliseconds. Starting a SQL Server or starting a MariaDB takes some seconds. Starting a SQL Server database takes up to a minute, and starting an Oracle database in a container takes around 3 minutes. So if you want to use test containers for testing your application, it's for sure very interesting if your database starts very fast, and that's also why I really like Postgres. We will see, you will not notice a difference. Who of you is using H2 or HSQL for testing purposes? Yeah, if you have seen my test containers demo, you won't do that anymore. The point is H2 is great. No word about H2, but the problem is H2 does not support everything. So if you have, for example, Postgres and you use certain SQL statements, for example, to create test data, then this will not work with H2. So you have to find a compromise if you're not using the same database during your tests as you do in production. And that's the reason why test containers is, in my opinion, such a great tool. Okay, so we have kind of a setup. Let's talk about code generation. So why do we need code generation? We need code generation because we want to have ID support. So I don't want to guess how my database table name is or what columns the database has. So I just want to use it. I also don't want to guess what the type of database column is. Otherwise, I always have to have a look at the database or at the database scripts to find out if this is a string type or if it's a number or whatever it could be. That's not necessary because I will get an exact copy in Java from my database. Then I will want to add type safety. Type safety means, for example, if I change my database and remove a column, then I want that my code no longer compiles. I don't want to write tests just to check if my SQL is correct. I want to just have the compiler check that and not the tests. Now, where should jOOQ take the database from? There are two options. Either you can use a real database, means you can use the database that is running somewhere. So some of my customers having kind of a reference database, and they're using that. Why don't they use test containers, by the way? If you have a database with a lot of tables, a lot of procedures, as the one that I was talking about before, then it may not be very handy to spin up in a test container. Or you need an image where the database already is. So they're using kind of a reference database. But most of the other customers are using a real database in test containers. And the question is, where does the schema come from? Who of you is using Flyway? Liquibase? None of these two options? Okay. Flyway and Liquibase are so-called database migration tools, and you can define SQL statements in the case of Flyway, for example, or you could use SQL statements or XML or some other ways to define your database schema. And if you start your test or if you start your application, Liquibase or Flyway will check the database because they will create database tables in your schema and check if you have the newest version. If you have not the newest version, it will apply the missing migrations, and so you are safe with the database migration. So we will also want to run the migrations during the generation phase, for example. But we could also go ahead and say, no, I don't want to work with a database. I want to use my DDL script. So I could use the DDL scripts that I use with Flyway or Liquibase, or in any other way, I could also use that together with jOOQ. And jOOQ will parse the SQL statements and generate Java objects from the SQL statements. The point is that's limited, because otherwise jOOQ had to create a generator for every database and to know all the differences in the statements, for example, or in the different object types. And so it's better to use a real database. By the way, because jOOQ needs to know a lot of databases, there are also some tools that jOOQ created because they had to create it anyway. So for example, jOOQ has a website where you can go and put, for example, an Oracle query in a text field and then hit convert and convert it to some other database-specific query. So you can, for example, if you need to do a migration from Oracle to DB2 or something, or the other way around, then you could use this tool to convert your SQL statements. Now, code generation is quite a huge topic, and here you see the jOOQ code generator in the documentation, and this is XML. So that means you don't need any tools to do that. You could also do that standalone, so you could use create an XML file, for example, and then run the jOOQ generator, or you could use that because it's already XML and put it in your Maven plugin configuration, and then it will do the same. And you could also use jOOQ programmatically, by the way, or there's also examples for Gradle here. But what I like to show you here is that usually the thing that jOOQ needs to generate is a database connection. So you need to define the driver, the URL, username, and password to run the generation, and then you can define which database you want to use. So these are the supported database types that you have here. Then we have this DDL database down here. That means you can generate it from DDL statements. That's another funny one. You can use your JPA mappings to generate the jOOQ code there. I never used that, but it would work. And there is a special implementation for Liquibase databases, because Liquibase has also this XML and other possibilities to define that. And so on, so on. We don't have a look at that now. So what we want to do is have a look at the example project. So this is called jOOQ Sakila, and it has two branches. So there's a main branch, that's a starting point. Yeah, sorry.
Is there a way to avoid putting the password into the POM file?
The question is there a way to avoid putting the password into the POM file? Yes, for sure. So I mean, you can use any Maven variable to use that, and you can get the variable from somewhere. You can pass it when you build that. But you will see just in a minute that with test containers it really doesn't matter. Yeah. Yes? Yeah. The question is, how often do you need to run the generation? Every time you change the database. So if you change the database model. So if you add a field or a table or drop a table or do something like that, you have to regenerate it. No. If you want to use the generated code, you have to do that. Yeah. We will see it. It's very easy. So let's have a look. So the main branch here is meant as a starting point. So if you want to do the exercises, you will get, or you can see the slides or get the slides also. Then you can start here and do the exercises. So if you go to the tests section, you will find here two packages. One is called demo. That's a copy of the demo of the usual jOOQ demo with all possibilities that is shown here. But there is also an exercise package, and these are the exercises from the deep dive today. So for example, we have this one, and here we see that all the tests are empty. So that would be your work to add them. Here I put one as an example, and here we already see something special. So I told you that we will use PostgreSQL, but this dual there, does anybody have an idea where dual comes from? Dual is a special table in Oracle databases. So this is a table with just one record inside, by the way. And you use that to execute the function without doing something with the database table. So you do select from function, whatever, select function from dual, for example. But the interesting thing about that is I can put that here and execute it with Postgres, and jOOQ will know, oh, dual is for Oracle, but we will emulate it in other way for Postgres. So that's something interesting. So just if you see that. But before we start, let's have a look at our Maven POM file. So I use Spring Boot here. I see that's not the newest version in the solution. I have the newest one. And then we have some properties. Here we have the Spring Boot jOOQ starter. We also have the Spring Boot data JPA starter. That's just because I also want to show you how to integrate jOOQ with JPA. Other than that, I wouldn't need that because everything you need is in the jOOQ starter for databases. I use Flyway. I use Flyway just because I like it more. So there's no special reason for that. I also use Liquibase in projects. I use Flyway for small examples because I just can put some SQL statements and they will be executed. I don't have to write change sets and change logs and stuff. So that's why I use Flyway here. Then I use Postgres and I use TestContainers to test. We will see that in a minute. Then something interesting happened because TestContainers is a great tool to test stuff with databases. The TestContainers team has a new member. He's called Siva. He's from India. And he was playing around with jOOQ and saw, it's hard to generate jOOQ code from TestContainers and Flyway or Liquibase. So because what must happen to do that here, you would need to start a test container database first. Then you would need to apply the Flyway scripts, and then you must run the jOOQ generator to generate the source code, right? So 3 steps. We did that before with the Groovy Maven plugin to spin up the test container, then the Flyway Maven plugin to run the Flyway scripts, and finally the jOOQ generator plugin. So Siva from TestContainers and some other colleagues now created a test container jOOQ CodeGen Maven plugin. And this integrates everything. So we just need to define that which test container we want to use. So here in my case, I want to use Postgres. And then I can just go ahead and say, okay, let's configure that. I configure a database of type Postgres. Here I can define the latest image. Here I use Postgres latest. I wouldn't do that really because I don't know what latest is. I would rather add a version, but for the test it really doesn't matter which image I use. And here I define username, password, and database. That's not necessary. I just do that because in my SQL scripts that I use to create the database, I reference the user Postgres and the database Postgres, right? If you have SQL scripts that just create a table and you don't care about the user and don't care about the database where it's created in, from the point of view of your Flyway scripts, you don't need to specify them. So TestContainers will create a dummy user password and database for you, and that's it. And then there's something in that is also not required, but I let it in the Maven POM just because it's easier to explain. We have a Flyway section. So the first section, this database section here, starts the database in TestContainers. Then the Flyway section here defines where the Flyway scripts are. This DB migration in the source main resources directory is the default path for Flyway, so I wouldn't even have to specify that. But it's for the explanation, I let it in. And then we have the jOOQ section, and the jOOQ section, this generator, is exactly the XML from the documentation. So if you go to the jOOQ documentation, have a look what you can generate with jOOQ, then you can just copy that here and that works. So for example, we can define which schemas that we want to use. So we can filter, we can exclude, we can include stuff. We could also exclude certain tables like this Flyway table. So Flyway will create a table. Flyway migration history is the name of the table, and I don't want to have that for my application because I don't want to access this table. So I exclude it here. And there are many more configuration that you can do there. For example, if you're using a MySQL or a MariaDB and you want to use Boolean, what happens usually, it creates a tiny int column for your Booleans with 0 and 1. And here you could have like a converter that converts your tiny int column into a Boolean type in your generated Java code. Now, in the generate section, we can define what we want to have. Generated POJOs, POJOs to string, POJOs equals and hardcode and DAOs. I will tell you what will happen when I do that. And finally, I can define a target package where I want to have the generated code in. So we have this database model. Let's get back to it. We have this database model with all these tables. And these tables are here from, also copied from jOOQ, GitHub repo. We have the migrations, so we have like something that set up the schema. Then we have like creating the tables. We also have types. Who knows what database types are? User-defined types, domains, something like that. Someone knows about that? No. You can do a lot of it, the database. For example, here, the MPAA rating, by the way, I had a look what MPAA means. MPAA stands for Motion Picture Association of America. Now it's called only MPA, by the way. That schema is very old. The America was removed from the name. And these are the ratings of the film. So if you have a film, you see these ratings. And I can define an enum in the database, for example. Like you can do that with Java, you can also do that in the database. And here we have G, PG, PG13, R, and then C17, for example. I don't know if this is really the whole list of ratings that are available. That means I can use that to check my database database data in the database directly. I can also create a domain. Domain is something that we don't know in Java, and I'm very unfortunate that this doesn't exist. It's a type alias. So that is very handy. So if you are already into a domain-driven design talk, they also say that, for example, if you have a first name, you should create a first name class to define that the first name is a first name and not just a string, that you don't make mistakes. And the same you can do here in the database. So I could create a user-defined type called year. But other than that, I can also add a check constraint. So for example, here I can define that my year is an integer and it must be greater or equal than 1901 or less than equal than 2155. So I can add checks to the database. The question is if you should do that or not. That depends on how well you treat your database. Because, for example, if you have an application like the ERP system that I was talking about, this exists for 35 years. And the database structure is more or less the same. They just created new versions of the application, and the application I'm currently working on with my customer is version 5. So they have the 5th generation of the same application on the same database. So maybe it's a good idea to treat the database very well, because it probably will stay longer than your application, depending on the application that you have. What we also have here is functions, for example. We also have here other functions. For example, we have a function that checks if a film is in stock in a certain store, for example. And this is used to show you how easy it will be to execute this function. And that's not very interesting here. But what we also have in the section of the test, we have test data. So it will, first of all, here the sequences are set to correct version, correct value, and then we have some test data. This uses Postgres copy statements, so you can't run that with JDBC, by the way, usually. So you have to add the copy library or copy manager API that this works. So you usually can't execute that in a regular SQL browser or executor like here in IntelliJ. This is not it's not possible to run. So now we have set up that, and I hit compile, And then we will see what will happen here. So first, the first plugin that will run is the TestContainers jOOQ code chain main plugin. It's a very, very long name. And here we see TestContainers in actions. TestContainers will check if I have Docker on my machine or Docker container engine on my machine. And then it will connect to that. And the first thing he will start is a container called jOOQ. jOOQ is a management container that will take care to shut down the started container after I'm finished with the build. And that's why there is such a container. And then it will start a container Postgres latest that was very fast, like 0.79 seconds to start Postgres. And now it runs on a random port here. And next, the red one, that is Flyway. Flyway will now connect to this database. So behind the scenes, this plugin will configure the data source for Flyway that he can execute the schemas or the schema SQL statements. And then we have jOOQ. And jOOQ will now take the input database. Here you see the configuration that we have. Then here we also see what we can generate. There are a lot of things that we can generate, by the way. Some is true, some is false. It's not so important. But then it scans the database. And we see that it fetched, for example, 32 tables. And one was excluded. The one excluded is our Flyway database that we don't want to have. And it also has fetched indexes, and then it generates code. So it generates code for address, category, city, film, etc. So for every database table, I will now have a Java class. I will also have classes for my stored procedures, and there will also be records. So let's have a look what has been generated. If you don't define that, it will generate to target generated sources, jOOQ. You don't have to care about that. IntelliJ will find these files and add the directory to the class path, so it just works. And here we have some classes that are for the main database. For example, we have a class with all the tables that are in the database or all the indexes. And depending on what you want to do, this comes in very handy. So maybe some of you already used result set metadata to generate something. So you have like a little framework that does something. You can, for example, go ahead and generate like a master data administration application just out of the database. And with jOOQ, you can use the Java files. You don't have to scan the database yourself. So we will have here, first of all the tables. So for example, let's have a look at the actor, for example. Then we see here that this table has a lot of constants, this class. So this is the constant for the table, actor, and we will have constants for every field or every column. And these constants we will use to build the SQL statements in a type-safe way. So for example, if we use then this first name constant and the first name changes to name, for example, then my code will no longer compile, because if I rerun the jOOQ generation, first name is no longer here. And that's the way this works. And here we have a lot of information that you also can use. So for example, we know which field it is, we know the type, we know if it's nullable or not, we know if it's a primary key or not, so on. And we even would get comments. And the comments is quite an interesting thing. So if you add comments to your database tables, you would also see them here. So if you use like the field first name, you will see the comment that is at the field first name that may help you if you develop your application. What we also get is records. A record is, and we will see that later on, a record is kind of an active record pattern implementation. Do you know what the active record pattern is? not everybody. Do you know Ruby on Rails? So the active record pattern means we have the idea that we create a class, an active record, that holds the data of a database table, for example, but that also holds the functionality. So we can delete an actor here, or we can store an actor, or we can find. So Ruby on Rails, for example, because Ruby is a dynamic language, it will create finder methods on the fly, for example. And that's not possible here because we are with Java, but that's the idea of this active record pattern. And this active record pattern is used in jOOQ, and it generates for every table that has a primary key a class that extends updatable record. Updatable record means that updatable record, when we have a look at that, this has this has some functionality like store, for example. That's the idea of that. And we will use that. We also had some other things that are created, but we don't care about that at the moment. Now that we have generated everything that we need, we want to start building SQL with that. So the first thing that we need to use or need to know is how we do that. So we need to know how we can use the jOOQ domain-specific language at which classes or interfaces we have to use. So the problem that we have is SQL is declarative, but in my opinion that's no longer kind of a problem, because since Java 8 we have streams and the stream API. So I would say developers are used to write declarative code. In all the times before Java 8, this was probably not always the case. There were a lot of while or for loops to iterate over code and then get things out that you want to map to something else or whatever you want to do with the data. And SQL is purely declarative. So that means you have to think what you want to have, not how you want to have it. And that's why jOOQ created a kind of a DSL that looks like SQL and is also there to use that. By the way, you can use this DSL also without the generated code. So if you don't like the code generator, then you can just use the names of the tables and the columns instead of the constants that I've shown you before. But I wouldn't recommend that because you lose the compile time checking for sure. So there are a lot of interfaces that you have to know, but there is one class called DSL context, we will see that in a minute, and another class called DSL. And the DSL class has a lot of convenience for you. There are a lot of statics methods on this class that you can use to build your SQL, but the main class that you will use is the DSL context class. And with that you can write SQL statements, execute stored procedures, whatever you like to. Sometimes you want to configure that because you need some additional configuration. And this one here is an example from Spring Boot, but for the Quarkus developers this looks very similar, just a bit different. But here with Spring Boot you will create a configuration class with the bean factory method. And this has this default configuration customizer as a return value. And then, because this is the new way to do that, they introduced it with Spring Boot 3, I would say. Before you had, you would use that differently, but now it's like that. And here we can use the settings of this default configuration customizer from jOOQ. And then, for example, we could say that we don't want to render names in cases. So, by the way, most databases are case insensitive. Some are case sensitive. For example, MariaDB and MySQL depends on the operating system where you run it. So if you run it on Windows, it's case insensitive. If you run it on Linux, it's case sensitive. And with others like Oracle, you can put the names in double quotes. In other databases, you have to put the names in backticks to make it case sensitive. And if you don't want to do that, because jOOQ will do that for you, so you don't have to care about that. But if you don't want to that jOOQ will do that, you can turn it off here, for example, or you could also do some configuration like execute with optimistic locking, but we will see that what that means. So let's have a look at this DSL context. If we wouldn't have any framework like Quarkus or Spring Boot, then we would do something like that. So we would need a connection to the database. We need to specify the dialect, and then we will get back this DSL context. For my side, I use DSL as the name of the variable that points to DSL context. If you look at the documentation, Lukas uses create usually because he says, I want to create something and start with create. I use DSL because I like it more. And here we see SQL. So that means we can do DSL select. If you don't add any columns there, it's the same as select star. Then we have from, and the book here is now the constant from the book class. And then we can go ahead and create a condition, for example. We can have book that has a column title, and the book is of type table, by the way, and title is of type field. So field has a lot of methods like, greater than, equal, and so on. And here we do a like with an animal, and the fetch returns a result. A result is an implementation of list, because usually, or not usually, the result of the database is always ordered. Sometimes you define the order by, other than that, the database decides in which order you will get back the data. So that's the easy thing that you can do, for example. We could also do joins. So, for example, here we have this film actor table that is for the many-to-many relationship between film and actor. And here we can write a join on, and then we see here film actor, actor ID equal actor ID. But because jOOQ already knows about these relationships, you don't need to specify them in SQL. jOOQ knows something, it's called implicit joins. Who is using Hibernate, by the way? There you have the same. If you're using JPQL or HQL, then you could do the same with film actor, point actor, and something like that. So you can navigate with that. For jOOQ, it generates a method called actor. So selecting film actor last name will select the last name of the actor, and this statement will do an implicit join when it executes the SQL statement. And then there is the superpower of jOOQ. Now, I will have another talk tomorrow about that, but let's have a look at an application just to give you an idea. This application here is a track and field management application. So I'm in a sports club in Switzerland. Let's make it a bit bigger. And we have some competitions for kids every year, like 2 or 3 times. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I always forget to stop the presentation mode. That's this application. It's called JTAF, Java Track and Field. It's an open source project. I'm already working for, 27 years or so. And we are having competitions for kids. We do track and field, so long jump and run and shot put and stuff like that. And we have that every year. So you see every year 3 times. This one was in late August. And what I have to do there is I have to manage the kids that are coming and in which category they will be. And finally, and that's the thing that I want to show you, I need to create a ranking list. And if you have a look at this list, you will see it looks like that. That's a PDF that is generated. And the interesting thing about that, this ranking list is generated from one single SQL statement. So if you would do that with any other technology like Hibernate or so, you would get a some product with a lot of duplicate data. Because we have here on top, that's the competition. We have a category. In the category, we have here the Lukas. That's one of the participants. Then we have 80 means 80 meters. That are there. He had 12 seconds and 12 milliseconds. That gave him 402 points, and so on. So we have like a tree of data. And with jOOQ, I can fetch that data in one go. And this superpower is called multiset. We will see that in a minute. The point about this multiset is not SQL standard. Currently, the group that is standardizing SQL is discussing about adding support for multisets to SQL, because in SQL usually you will always get the table. You cannot get nested structures back from a SQL statement, at least not with standard SQL. And so they are currently discussing how to nest results inside other results. So that's an application of that. And we will see that how this looks in our application. So I will switch the branch to the solution. And that was this one. So that's the one that you already know about the dual. But we have here some other queries. So for example, we can select from actor. So that's a convenience method. Otherwise, I would have to write DSL select point from actor. If I want to get all the columns from the actor table, I can have this shortcut with select from, for example. Here we have an example again with the join. Here we also have the projection. So I just want to have the title and the name, and then I join it. Here we have the same with an implicit join. And the interesting thing is, how does that look when I run it? To see jOOQ statements, you can enable a logger, and the logger is called org.jOOQ, and you can set it to debug. You can also set it to trace, then you get much more information, but that's usually not needed. But you should use it in the debug mode. Then you see something when you execute the test, and let's do that. So here I have a title and a print method. That's not my ID, that's the ID of Lukas, but I use that here. So title prints out this title, that I find the statements easier, and print line does just system out print line of the result, but it's just handier to use it like that. So, and if I run this query, a lot of things happens. So first of all, as I use test containers, let's have a look at the application properties again. Not the application properties, wait a minute. The test. Here. We want to select the films, and it's a test. But what I didn't show you is it extends from a jOOQ test container test. And what's this jOOQ test container test? jOOQ test containers test is a Spring Boot test. By the way, if you know Spring Boot test slices, this is not correct, right? You shouldn't use Spring Boot test usually for database tests. And that's why there is also another annotation called jOOQ test. It's the same like data JPA test or any other of this persistent layer test slices that Spring Boot offers, and this comes with Spring Boot starter, Spring Boot jOOQ starter. But here I use Spring Boot test because I also have tests that rely on transactions, and so I need this transaction stuff. But other than that, if I create jOOQ tests, I would use jOOQ test. What I do here is first I inject the DSL context. So now, because I use the Spring Boot starter, I get this DSL context auto configuration by Spring, and then I can use that in my tests. But I also do that. There is I create a Postgres test container. So here, again, I use the same database name, username, and password, just for convenience. It's just because of the scripts. Other than that, I could use any names here, doesn't really matter. And then in an initializer, in static initializer, I start the database. And with the dynamic property source here, I can set it to Spring Data Source URL, Spring Data Source password, username. If you know the latest version of Spring Boot, you know that's an old way to do that, right? Now we have these service connections with Spring Boot 3.1, I think, and I could just avoid more or less this code here, but I just let it in because it's clear what happens. So that means I configure or I start a test container, or test container starts a Postgres container for me, and it configures Spring Boot that it can run the tests against this test container. And here the test container, as you can see, it does the same as before with the generation. It starts this jOOQ test container, and then it starts Postgres latest, and then we have a lot of log stuff. And then here we have the migration of Flyway. And finally, down here somewhere, we find our test. So that's the interesting part. And here we see jOOQ. By the way, jOOQ has a tip of the day. That's also only in the open source version. This banner here that will be removed in if you have a subscription, for example, and you get the tip of the day like you have if you start IntelliJ or any other tools. Don't ignore them. Often they have interesting insights. And then we see the SQL statement that is executed, like here. So it executes a SQL statement. Here we only have one SQL statement because I read every film. If you do like a condition, then jOOQ will always create a prepared statement. So even if you do dynamic SQL, you will get a prepared statement. That means jOOQ saves you from SQL injection. So with prepared statements, you will not have the problem of SQL injection. So with jOOQ, you will not be able to create dynamic SQL with SQL injection. You can do that if you use strings for SQL. If you don't use the generated code and the DSL, then you could do that as well, because the DSL context also has a fetch method where you can put in a SQL statement in a string. There you could get that problem, but usually if you do that, it doesn't do that. And why do I tell you that? Because if I would create a statement with some condition, then I will log the query twice. First with the question mark, as you know. So that's the annoying part if you use Hibernate, for example, and start a logger or define the logger, then you will get these question marks. You also have to add a logger for types. But jOOQ will inline the parameters. So you see the query exactly how it will be executed in the database, and that's very handy because you can copy that and use that for testing purposes or to get the execution plan or whatever you like to do. And what jOOQ also does with this debug level, it also samples 5 records of the result that you can see what you get to check if your query is okay or not. But it will not fetch every row because this doesn't make sense. But here I for sure, no, I didn't. It didn't print everything because it fetches 100 rows, and here we have this data. Now, before we do a short break or a long break, the question that comes up maybe is, what's the result? Because here I'm using this type inference, the var keyword. I don't see the type, right? But and usually I'm not interested in the type of the result, right? Because I already know what it will be because I'm using jOOQ. But let's have a look at what it really is. The result is record 2 of type string string. Why that? Because my projection says I have 2 columns, so that means I need a record that exactly takes 2 arguments, and both are strings, obviously. So the name is a string and the film title is also a string, and this makes it type safe as well. Now the problem with that, we will see that after the break, is how can I take things out of that? Because record is if we just have a look at that, that's just an interface, and it has some methods like values rows, field 1, value 1, stuff like that. That's maybe not that handy. But before we do that, I would say we do a short break. Half an hour, I think, is planned until 11:15. And then we will have a look how we can manage the results that we get back from jOOQ. Okay, welcome back. Now that we've seen that we get records back, we also should have a look at this superpower called Multiset. And here I made an example. So in that case, I want to get the name of the category, and I want to have a list of films per category. So I would say if you're building REST APIs or something like that, then this may be very familiar. So you want to have a tree data or nested data. And jOOQ can do that as well. So for example, if we execute that, let's see what will happen. Here we see that it executes the query, but the query may look a bit weird. Because here you see that we have something like JSON-B aggregate and stuff. So what the heck is doing jOOQ? jOOQ is emulating the multiset because, as I said, this multiset is not in SQL standard. But that's something that the SQL standardization team is discussing, how they can integrate that in the SQL standard. But as you know, it takes a very long time to get SQL standards inside SQL databases. But the good thing is that this JSON functionality, like this JSON-B aggregate or JSON build array and stuff like that, this is supported by many, many databases. So I would say most of the commonly used databases have JSON functionality, and that's why also this multiset support is supported. Now, also here the question, what will we get back? Here we get back again the result. That means a list of a record 2, but in this case only the first parameter is a string, and then we get a result of a record 1 again of type string. So that's what we get back. Now the question is how we can work with these results. The point is the record. So for example, if I go to the result and get the first element, and then I can either use field 1. Field 1 would point to category name, but is this type safe? I would say no. But there's another way. You can you can get the element by name. So you can say get, and here I could say 0, or is it 1? Also not a good idea. It would be 1. Like everything in SQL is 1 based, but I could also use this one. And so if, for example, the category name would change to an integer, that is not very realistic, but just to make an example, then my code will not compile. But is this really how I want to work? Maybe not. So we need some other ways to work with results. So let's get back where we left. Yeah, there are some slides about SQL execution. For sure, under the hood, everything is a prepared statement or a callable statement when we want to execute a store procedure for something. But you really don't see anything of JDBC. So you are not on that layer. You can use jOOQ. And jOOQ, beside that, what I've shown you before is that the fetch is overloaded or not overloaded. It has many more ways to fetch data. So the easiest way is to fetch a result. So you get a list of records. So currently we only know it could be a record, but we will see what it could be else. Then we have fetch one. That means we want to have one, or it may return null. So the question is this a good idea to return null from such a statement? I would say no, because we have optional, and that's why we also have a fetch optional method. So this would prevent us from null pointer exceptions, because we know that it may be optional. Or we can use fetch single. Fetch single will throw an exception if there is more than one result, or it will throw an exception if there is no result. So it depends what you want to do. You can use either of these. Yeah, there are some, there's also exercise, but this is not very interesting, so we can more or less skip it, but let's have a look. So that's what we already seen. Here we see other things. So here we see an order by that also works. I hate PowerPoint, because if you're in presentation mode and switch, you only see it here. So let's go here. We can also do order by for sure. As you can see, this is a field. It also has a method descending or ascending, for example. And then we have paging. So we can use offset and limit. And you can use that with every database. So jOOQ will decide how to implement that under the hood. So there are a lot of discussions about offset and limit and how to do paging. But this could be a way to do that. And finally, we have this optional. So the result here, the type of this result is for sure an optional of that one. Now, here in that case, we are selecting from the whole table. So in the other examples, we just selected a few elements. But if you look at this one, oops, that was not exactly what I wanted to do. Like this. So it returns an optional of type customer record. Now, what's that customer record? That's also generated code. For every database table, jOOQ generates such a record class. We have already seen that. And if you select from, you mean you select star, then you get the customer record back. And here, this now is better than the record 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Because here you can, oops, here you have all the fields. So you have get first name, last name, and stuff like that. Huh? So, okay. Now, let's have a deeper look at this one. That's what I already shown you. But this record 1, 2, and so on, this is created by jOOQ, and it supports up to degree 22. I really don't know why 22 when I look at this slide. But this means you can do a projection in your select statement of 22 records. If you have more, you just get a record, and then you have to. Then it's no longer a typed record. But usually, record 1 to 22 is good enough. Sometimes you don't even need that. We will see that. So often you can use the record, for example, the film record that we had before, or any other generated record, but you can also create your own classes instead of using these records. And this record has it's an interface, and this has some methods like field 1, field 2, then you can get information about the field, or you get the value 1 or 2, or you can call get, as I've shown you before, then you can define which field you want to get back. There is also a section about arrays, maps, and lists. That means you can have as a return value a lot of different stuff. For example, there is a possibility to call the fetch method and just pass a field or a column name of the database table, then you get exactly only that value back. So for example, here I want to select from book and get only the titles, then I get a list of string, or I could even that fetch into an array instead. Yes, thank you. I'm happy that you sit in the first row. Sorry about that. There are other methods like to get values back. So the fetch method also takes parameters. For example, you can pass a column like the title, and then you get a list of strings back. Or you can fetch an array, then you get an array of titles. That's a way to do that, but you could also do the other way around. So you could say create select book title from, and then you will only get those. That's more or less the same thing. Then sometimes you want to do something with the records that you get back. The record handler, by the way, is deprecated. It's just for that is complete here in the examples, but that's also why it's red here. You can also use fetch-in-to to do something. For example, here I use a record handler, then I get a callback for each record in that fetch method here in the lambda expression, and can print it out or do something else. But this one is really deprecated. What I also can do is what I've shown you before, but something that's very handy because you often want to have a stream for something. You could also call stream instead of fetch, then you get directly a stream back. You could also use fetch and stream, but this doesn't make sense, so you can use directly stream, but don't do something with that stream really. So what I often see is the find all anti-pattern of Spring Data JPA. Have you heard about that? You call find all, and then you do filtering and sorting in the stream instead of the database. So stream is often not really a good choice. But if you want to do for each or something like that, then it's maybe interesting. What's interesting also, databases offers cursors. What is cursor? A cursor is a way to not load all data at once, just to have like an infinite stream of data where you have to call next, and then you get the next portion of your data. And that could also be done with jOOQ. You can call fetch lazy, and fetch lazy will return a cursor. Let's see the type of that one as well. Oops. Oh, that doesn't matter here. It doesn't work so. But you get the cursor, and then you can iterate over the cursor and call fetch next. That's very handy if you do kind of batch processing, because you don't want to load all the data at once into the memory and process that. That's maybe not a good idea. So you could use cursors. So that means you can, now we know how to execute SQL. So if you know SQL, you can do more or less everything with it. You can have different return types. But now, how do we update this data? And for updating, for a simple case, you can use this generated updatable records. So if you want to do this create, read, update, delete, you can do that. That means you have already everything in place to do that. So if you have a simple UI and just want to display the record, you can enter the data and save it, then you're good to go. As I said, this updatable record implements the active record pattern. And something that is important to say is that you need a primary key for that. It's not really a primary key. It's okay if it's a unique identifier on the database defined, because if you want to do an update, you have to know which record in the database to update. Often these are auto-generated. So let's have a look at how this is done in the Sakila database. The Sakila database uses sequences. So sequences are database objects, by the way. And if we have a look at the generated data, then we should probably also find the sequences. Let's check if I'm wrong or not wrong. Keys, that is in keys, that's the unique key. Do we here have the sequences? No. No, we don't have. Are these really sequences? Wait a minute. Are the tables created? There is a sequence. And the sequence here is used as a default value, by the way. So if I insert a new record, then I get a new value from the sequence. Who is using Hibernate? You know, if you use Hibernate, this would mean I would use identity as generation strategy, right? If I use the generated value annotation. Is this a good idea with Hibernate? It's a nice question. It's not. Because the problem with that approach is if you need the primary key in Hibernate, because the contract with Hibernate is if you call persist, entity manager persist, the contract is after persist, the entity has a valid primary key or a valid ID, it's called in Hibernate. And to do that with the default value like that, it has to execute an insert statement. Is it a good idea to execute an insert statement in Hibernate before you even have done something with the entity? Maybe not. Because this could lead to some constraint violations because your data is not completely entered already. With jOOQ, it's not a problem because you don't have this lazy fetching or lazy data access stuff. So if you want to insert the data, you call insert. So it doesn't insert. So how to get back the ID with the insert? It depends on the database. So if you know MySQL or MariaDB, this has this auto increment column definitions. And then you have a special select statement that you can call to get the latest number back from this auto increment. Most databases also support a returning clause in the insert statement. So you can say insert blah 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 into returning and here actor ID. And that's what jOOQ is using. He's using returning, and then the actor record, for example, has this sequence attached. But I'm still confused why the sequences are not generated. I have to check that. Okay, so you need something like a primary key. And if you have that, then you can go ahead and use this method. So there is a store method, a delete method, and a refresh method. I think there is also an insert and an update method, but it doesn't matter because jOOQ knows if it should do an update or insert. That's relatively easy because if there's no primary key assigned, there's usually nothing in the database. Refresh is also sometimes handy because it could be that another transaction updates the data and then you want just refresh that. And how does this look like? There is another test for that. We have here the updatable record test. And in this one, let's check. We have a save method. And here we create a new record. Now, why I don't only instantiate the rental record? Because I could also do that. So I could have a new rental record, right? That's the same, or I would say it looks the same. Let's say that's rental 1. So what's the difference between line 23 and 24? Sorry? Default values. No, the default values are usually assigned by the database, not by jOOQ. But a good point. Now the point is, with the second one, the record is attached. You know that from Hibernate, you have managed and unmanaged state. And jOOQ needs to know about the record. And that's why you call DSL new record and pass the table as the argument, and then you get a managed record. So when you do that, then you have then you can use the record to store. We will see that later on. You could also use the DSL context to attach it. So I could also do that, like so. No, I don't. That's fine. Doesn't need the return value. That's the same, but in my opinion, it's one line less and more readable if you use the new record method. So now I can go ahead and set the values, and then I get some data. And here we see a typical use case where we just want, for example, the ID, because now I need to find the person that is renting or that is working in the store and rents the video. That's the Mike Hiller in this case. And I need his ID to set it as a foreign key. And then I need to find Andrea Henderson. She's renting the movie. Then I can set the customer ID. And finally, I need the inventory ID, and then when I'm finished, I can store it. And here store, when we run it, it will execute an insert statement. Oops. So here we have first the select statements, and here we can see now that for debugging purposes, jOOQ is inlining the parameters. That's very handy, right? Because that's the query that is executed to the database. It's a prepared statement. That's why it has here the placeholder. But jOOQ also can use that. By the way, you can even use jOOQ as a SQL logger, also with Hibernate, so that jOOQ will log the statements for Hibernate, for example, if you configure that. And then we select the customer and the inventory. And finally, we do the insert into, and here we see this returning, right? So the result of the insert statement is not nothing, because usually the return of an insert statement or of a updatable statement or a modifying query is usually the number of modified rows. So normally you get 1 here, but because we have the returning, we get 16050, and this is the new rental ID that is generated. And that means if I would create a breakpoint here with the updatable record in the save method, I would see that the rental here has the ID assigned, and now I can continue and work with the ID. That's how this works. So it's very simple to do that, and the application that I've shown you before is full of this stuff, because you usually create such applications. So if you go back to that one, very often your applications look kind of this, or not your, but I have so many customers that are doing business applications, often in-house business applications, and there you very, very often have this type of, where's my cursor? So here are we with the application, and there you have tons of these. You can click it. Here we have like a dialog, or it could be a form attached to the grid, whatever, or an inline editing grid. And here I exclusively use these generated records because this is good enough. Yeah, question? Yeah. The question was, can I have generated values like an update timestamp or an insert timestamp or something like that? Or the user? Yeah. You have to do that in terms of using a listener. So jOOQ provides listeners. I mean, with Hibernate, it's also a listener that is executed. And you can create, like, there are a variety of listeners that you can implement with jOOQ. And one of that you can fetch, for example, the user from the security context if you have a Spring Boot application, and set the timestamp. Yeah, it's not out of the box because there's no jOOQ. Like if you Spring Boot, you have this auditable user, I think it's called, or auditable entity, and then you have two entity listeners and stuff. But it's the same. Yeah, you can have listeners. You can even manipulate the SQL statement. For example, if you do, you have a multi-tenant application. And there are, you know what multi-tenancy is, right? So you have the same application for multiple users, for multiple organizations, whatever. And there you can have different strategies. You could have that in the same table, then it's just a marker column in the table, but you can also do that with different schemas or different databases even. And that you can do with jOOQ as well. So you can have a rewrite and add the schema depending on some configuration about the tenant, for example. Yeah, that's where we use listeners, or you can use listeners, for example, also to set some database-specific stuff. You know, if you run your code against a database, in the database there you have a session, usually. And on this session in the database, you can add additional values. So it's like a session, it's like a HTTP session, but on the database level. And for example, I could add additional configuration or additional information. For example, the user is a good idea because you usually don't access the database with the user that the user is logging in. You could do that. I have a customer that is using Oracle users for the users that are using the application. But that's not very common these days. But you often want to have the user in the database for some stored procedures or a function or something like that. And then you can set values on the session. And that you could also do just before the SQL statement runs. Or you could log the execution time, for example, or something like that. There are various things that you could do. So it's very easy to store that. But very often, these updatable records are not enough. I was talking about, for example, a REST API. You want to build a REST API, you use, for example, Spring MVC with a REST controller. And usually there, the result is some class or an object, usually nested or often a nested object. And this will be serialized to JSON, for example, with Jackson. You could also do the same with every framework. It doesn't matter. You could use JOX RS or something else. It works the same. Often, since we have Java records, these classes are records because they are immutable and they are very handy to do that. The question there is maybe, do you even need objects? But that's another discussion. But you could generate the JSON out of the database. You wouldn't need that to serialize to objects and serialize objects to JSON. You could directly return a JSON string. But here we don't want to do that. What we want to do, we want to work with POJOs. Means we have a class. This could be a record, by the way. In that case, it's mutable. It depends what you want to do. I have an int ID and a string title. And I want to have back, instead of either a book record or a record 1 to up to 22, I want to have my class. And this works because I could use fetch into, and then jOOQ will try to create out of the result instances of this class. How does jOOQ do that? I don't know. No, it's not true. But first it tries to find a matching constructor. If it doesn't find one, maybe there's a default constructor, and he uses scatter and setter or setters to populate the data. I could even use a converter for myself and do something with the result and create these classes. Usually it's best to have a constructor. So in that case, we have public fields that would also work. Depends what you want to do. What you also can do if you have such an object, because if we go again to the ID to have a REST API, someone could have the ID to use this book to store data. So we have a single page application, for example, and someone can change the title of the book. Then the book comes back to your application, and now what you do with jOOQ, that's also very easy. Here we have the book that's created here, but we can use also the new record method that we have seen before to put or to send an instance of a POJO. So in that case, we send the POJO to the method new record. That means jOOQ will create a new book record and populate the book record data with the data from my book. This not obviously only works if the attributes have the same name, so it does that by naming convention. But this is also very handy because often you don't want to send out your records because records are not heavy. It's not a heavy object with like a proxy or something, but there are some methods and stuff inside that you don't want to expose maybe over your API. So it's very handy to do that. So we can have a look at that. And I did something else because what I like to do is we have films. And the film has an attribute length. It's probably minutes how long the film is. And here we have an example with a record. So this is I always look in that direction because this gives me the indication. By the way, I'm stupid. I have here another screen, but forget about it. I have to show you jOOQ, not how presentation works. Okay, so here we have again the query. So we want to have the title of the film, the length of the film, and we want to have that in a POJO or in some other structure, because usually this would return record 2, and here we have, what's the type of that one? That's a small int. So this would be probably something like a record 2 with a string and a short. But we want to have something else, a record. So we have here a record that matches with the name and the short. But by the way, this could also be an int. jOOQ will do some conversion if it doesn't match fully. But here that's good enough. So we return here the film length, and I can run that to see that this really works. And records, by the way, if you really have to projection in SQL, then in my opinion, Java records are the perfect fit, because they are immutable, and usually the data that you get back from a SQL statement is not mutable, because you do some calculation, maybe aggregate stuff and whatever, or join a lot of tables to get data. So then the best is to get a record, and here we really have records, so we can see that because this is the standard 2-string implementation of the record here with the film length and then name and length and stuff like that. That works very well. So it's very easy to fetch data inside into such POJOs, and I would even say that's the easiest way to do that, because we have similar stuff. So if you have Hibernate, you can use the constructor expression. You know that. So it select new and then pass all the parameters, but then I have to pass a lot of parameters to a full qualification of the class, and it's not really type safe, because in my case, if the arguments do not match, then it doesn't work. Or I could use Bring Data JPA, for example. There I could do interface projection. That's similar, but via an interface when I want to have a record. And nested structures also don't work. They're currently working, by the way, with Spring Data JDBC on something like the multiset from jOOQ to have that as well. But in my opinion, that's really the easiest way to fill such data. And if you have a REST API, and a lot of applications have REST API, then this is a very, very, very well, very easy thing to do. Yeah, we could have other things here. So we have another that has a count and the first name and the last name, for example. Here we have an aggregate with the count of the film ID to see how many films an actor played in. By the way, this test data has a problem. No, it has not a problem. My code has a problem, because there is at least one actor with the same first name and last name. And here this works because I group it by, I group it by first name and last name. That wouldn't work, right? So here we have a problem. Then I could do the same. So here jOOQ will do the mapping, right? So fetch into, and then I pass a class. But I could also use a mapping method, and this is one of the methods that's on this DSL class. So that's a good. No, that's not entirely true. Where does the mapping come from? No, the mapping is from the record mapper, sorry. But I wanted to talk about the DSL class. Let's do it that anyway. The DSL class is a special class with jOOQ that has a lot of different helper methods. So for example, we have also the count that we have seen before. Where is it? Count here, for example. So there are a lot of helper methods that help you to create queries, right? And the result, by the way, of all the parts in the query, in the projection or in the where condition, are fields. So that's the name for a column. Lukas is not very happy that he chooses field. Column would be more obvious, in my opinion. On the other hand, now we have the problem with the records with Java, so naming is hard, It's not very easy. But you often use that. But the mapping here comes from the record, so we can use mapping, and that is a static method reference. So here we make a reference on the new, on the constructor of the actor with films. But we could also do that in other ways. So, for example, here we get the record 3. That's interesting that co-completion doesn't work, but we get this one here. So T1 in that case, we should name it right. That's first name, last name, and film ID, and then we could create that. We could run new actor with films count and T1, T2, T3, something like that. That would also work. But it's for sure shorter if we replace it with that one. So that's the mapping part. So you could map anything. You could even map the data type. So if we get back a Boolean and you want to have yes or no or something like that, you can do that in mapping. And this mapping is called for every record. So you can use that right away. And if you use a multiset, then the syntax is a bit more complicated because at the end I also have a mapping, right? So here we have a category with films with a film inside. And this is, by the way, this is an inner record. Just for name spacing, I did that. I wouldn't do that otherwise, maybe. And here at the final stage, I want to map this category with films. But I have an intermediate result, the result of the multiset, right? And I have to map, or not map, because I don't get the result here, I get the field. So the result of multiset, by the way, is a field. Do we see that here? Here, that's a field as a result. And so I have to convert the result in something else. So that means for the inner join, the inner select with the multiset, it will map to the film, so the inner record in the category films record, and finally it will map the outside. I can nest that. By the way, if you look at, you remember the ranking list from before the break? If I show you, here we are. So that's the, where is it? Here. That's the query for the competition ranking. So here, the first level is the competition with some information. Then we have a multiset with the category, a multiset with the athlete. Here, that's an implicit join. Then we have a multiset with the results. And this is finally converted everything to a competition ranking data. It's the name of the record. And this is a record with a record with a record with a record. So we have 4 levels. And that's very easy. So it's very easy to, if you know how to do that, by the way. But it took me a while to write the query, because if you do that for the first time, you have to understand how this convert from mapping and so on works. But if you know how to do that, then it's very handy and it saves you a lot of time, because you write how, or you write what you want to do, and you don't have to write how to do it, right? Because before I once was with my little open source project, I was using Hibernate before I moved to jOOQ, by the way. And there I had a for loop in a for loop in a for loop in a for loop to create the ranking list. Now that's no longer necessary. That's a good thing. Okay. Then, who knows what, yeah, sorry. Yeah, the question is how you get the native query out of this. I cannot show you here because I have no database running, but I can go to that one. That's the same, but just 2 levels. But if I execute it, I get the query here. So I could also execute the query by hand. Oops, where is it? That's that one. Right. So this query starts here. And you could simply take this query here, and I think I also have a connection to a database. So, and then there's the database here. Sorry? That's a single query, yes. Yeah, it's always a single query, because if we I have to connect. So if we format that, then we see the magic behind better. So here's, it's just one level, right? But as you can see, this one is the outer query, and then we have an inner query. So that's a join of that one and that one. And here, that's the inner select that references the outer query. And if you execute that, oops, didn't want to add an X. If you execute that, you get the result. And here you see the trick, right? So the first column is a normal column with just a string value. And the second column is something like a JSON without keys, right? And you can now go ahead and check this out. Yeah. But in the other query, because I'm creating a ranking list, I do that differently. I had, we will see that you can export data directly with jOOQ. And I export the data in a format that I can compare in the unit tests with this data. So that's something that you can do. Right? Good. Yes. Does anybody know what this abbreviation stands for? Still. Yeah. That's the old name for repository. No, that's not true. But data access object was introduced in 1999. Or maybe before, but I first heard about that in 1999 when they wrote a book that was called J2E patterns. There were also courses from Sun back in the days, and data access objects had the idea to hide the database behind the user. So that was that's also very blurry because it's a very old picture. And the idea was we had this business object that was maybe something like a service or something, and that calls a data access object. In Spring Boot, you talk about repositories because repository is a name more from domain-driven design, but the data access object and repository have the same idea. But here, the idea was also that you return transfer objects. Now, this data access object stuff can also be used with jOOQ. In the configuration, if you remember, in the POM file, there was a section called generator, and there I had like generate DAOs. And it will generate one DAO per updatable record, and you can use that then to work with the database. So what does it generate? First of all, it generates stuff. It generates finder or fetch methods in that case. So you have for every field, you have one for the primary key that returns one element, but you also get fetch by each column that you have that will return a list. And the return value is not a record. It also generates POJOs for you. So the book is a simple Java class, and the book DAO is a DAO. And now let's have a look at the code. This time I managed to do that. But now this is that one. So first have a look at what has been generated. Where we have that. jOOQ. Teams, tables. Here we have, first of all, POJOs. POJOs mean that we have for every table that is updatable, we also get such a class. And that's a normal Java class, right? So we have like attributes for every column in the database table. We have getters and setters. We have equals and hash code. Equals and hash code are just there because I said to generate equals and hash code. It's not even correct if this, I don't know. Yeah. No, we don't look at that and we don't discuss that. But equals and hash code is always a challenge, right? Especially if you work with Hibernate, and so it's also true sometimes if you work with any other persistent technology. Because relying on the primary key is maybe not a good idea, because if you have two actors that have no primary key, they could be the same, right? but they could be different. It depends. So the best to have a primary key, not the primary key, the best to implement equals and hash code is if you have a business key that you can rely on. Then it doesn't matter if it's a new or an existing object. But that's a completely different discussion. But now we have seen that there's an actor POJO, and we also get an actor DAO. And this one just implements a DAO impl from jOOQ. It is typed, so it has an actor record, and it returns an actor. And the last thing is along, that's the type of the primary key. And if we have a look at the methods that we get from that, we get a lot. So we get the count, we get the delete, we get delete by ID, we get exists, we get fetch, we get find by ID, fetch, range, whatever this could be, insert, merge, update, and so on. So there are a lot of methods on the DAO impl base class that you can use, and for your class it generates get ID, then you get back the ID. That's some convenience method, but you get what's interesting, fetch one by actor ID, for example, or you get fetch optional by actor ID. You get here we get fetch by first name and so on. So this is very handy as a starting point, but this probably doesn't solve all the problems. So how should I fetch by first and last name? This doesn't work. But the DAO is a very convenient starting point, so you can just add or create a subclass of this generated class and add some more finder or fetch methods, however you want to call it. But it's very convenient to use it because you also do that if you use, for example, Spring Data JPA. Then you have like this simple JPA, this JPA repository or paging and sorting repository and so on. That works quite well. Yeah, that's data access object. By the way, I don't use that. I usually don't use it. I have another application where I can show you something else. This is an application from a Swiss railway company, and it's in German, obviously, but it doesn't really matter. The point is, if they are working on the tracks, they change something, and then they have to add this information to an application called DFA, that stands for Datenfeste Anlagen. That means that's the that's how should I? It's a GIS system, so a information system. And but this cannot be accessed mobile or in the field, so I created a very small application that's Spring Boot with time leaf. So it's a very old technology used here. But what I like to show you is you very often have that kind of screen, right? So you want to search something. Let's say you want to have between Spiez and Zweisimmen, what happens there, and then I get a table of data. What's going on here with Bearbeiten is also the same, because this is a record, because this application just contains of one big table and a lot of small tables around. But I want to show you that something that we didn't talk about is how to do dynamic querying, because this is usually a problem. You know, if you use SQL, you have to concatenate strings. That's not good, because you have SQL injection. If you use Hibernate, you have also string concatenation with JPQL or HQL. So what you need to do is use criteria API. And this API is the most horrible API I've ever seen, in my opinion. But jOOQ is a very good fit for dynamic querying, because every part of the query that we've seen before in this Fluent API can be separated, because everything that you call has a type. And so if we have a look at the repository here that does the search, not save, I need the search. That's the find all. It's called find all DTOs because it returns also here kind of a DTO. That's an old one because that was created before Java records. Today this would be a record for sure. And we have also a DTO that contains the search data. Oops. that was not the ID. Exactly. Oops, it's now. What did I do? So now we see that we have relatively large projection, but that's normal because we just want to fetch that. But this is more or less the base query here. And what we have here is this no condition. You know, no condition often is used 1 equals 2, for example. And this is just, no, that's not true. No condition is 1 equals 1. That will be removed by the optimizer, so it doesn't matter. But what we have here a method that's called create condition and sort. And what we put here is the parameter with the sort. And we use the where. So we just went to the where in building the query. So the where must be of some type. And the where is of type select condition step. So we could even separate the query. So you could do, if I need the same projection in various places, I can just store them anywhere and then reuse that. So you can build the stuff together. And here what we do is simply check if it's null or not. There are some special cases for the checkboxes that you may have seen, and we add that. So here it complains because I don't use the return value, because I don't have to, because where is not immutable. So if I use where and, it adds this condition as an and. I also have or and other stuff. And finally I have the where condition. And then I could also create the order by fields finally, and that's very handy. So if you have to do a lot of such dynamic querying from search UIs or something like that, then this is also the best way to do that, because it's very easy. You know, it's practically straightforward. You would do that if you would do it with string concatenation. Here you can do it with the real Java API. Then some words about transactions. If you're using Spring Boot or Quarkus, I don't have to say anything because jOOQ just takes part of the transaction management of the framework. Or if you're using Jakarta IE, then you can use transactions that are already there. But you could also use the connection commit and rollback yourself if you like to. And even jOOQ has a transaction API. So if you don't have anything, for example, if you're using jOOQ in a batch processing application and you don't use a framework for that, like Spring Batch or something, then you could simply use transactions from jOOQ, and jOOQ DSL as a transaction method that takes a lambda, and in the lambda you get the transaction configuration. And what you should do is using this transaction configuration, because this is also a jOOQ configuration, and use the DSL from there, because this is then a special DSL context that you get inside the configuration. And there you can do whatever you want. For example, you can select something, and if the method is finished, it will implicitly commit. Or if you throw a runtime exception, it will roll back. So that's very convenient. Let me see. What's also interesting is something that doesn't work with, or what's not supported with Jakarta IE or Spring or whatever transaction management system, is nested transactions. Did anybody of you ever use nested transaction? jOOQ is able to do that. So I can nest a lot transactions here inside. So I could call on the transaction DSL again, transaction, and they will be separated from the rest. Nested transaction needs save points to make it work in the database, but you will not see that. So jOOQ is handling that for you. Then another thing that comes with transaction is optimistic locking. So if you're using Hibernate, you have this version field. This could be either an ID or a version number or a timestamp, and jOOQ can do the same. So I would say, let's have a look. Have you seen I managed to switch to the other thing? I think here this is configured with generation. Oh, exactly. I was asked, or we were talking during the break, and here's something that I do here. We have no booleans in this MariaDB. But the booleans are mapped to tinyInt1 with the length of 1, and I convert that. I hope no one else is using tinyInt1 for something else, but I map them to boolean. But I'm in the wrong project. I have to switch to the Sakila project. And here, let me see that. One thing that is used for optimistic locking is these record timestamp fields. So like you have to do that with Hibernate, you have to tell Hibernate which field to use. Here I do the same. Usually I use version numbers, not timestamps. I do that here because I want to show you that, and the Sakila schema has no version fields, but it has the last update timestamp. And so I use that as a record timestamp field. That means that jOOQ knows that last update is used for optimistic locking. If I don't specify a field, jOOQ uses every field or every column to compare state before and after, right? And so, and the other thing that I have to do is I have to configure that, because usually this is not activated, but here I do this with this bit execute or bit execute with optimistic locking to true, and then jOOQ does optimistic locking. But optimistic locking in jOOQ is not optimistic locking as it was with JPA in the first versions, because JPA just checked the version, right? Doesn't do anything else. Later on, there were the lock mode types, if some of you knows Hibernate quite well, where you can have the pessimistic write, you know. So pessimistic write means it does a select for update. And jOOQ combines that. That means first it will execute a select for update. So it will lock the record before it does anything. And then it will do the update statement, and it will, based on this field that I've configured, it will add that to the where condition. And finally, if this doesn't work, it throws a data changed exception. And there is also an example in the code. The optimistic locking exception, it's that one. Here, optimistic locking to test is not so easy, because I have to have concurrent transactions. And here I did some threading, so I have a thread 1 and thread 2. And in one, I read the same data, and finally I update, or I try to update it. In the first case, I sleep for 500 milliseconds, and I hope to get an exception, right? So if I run that, but I do not check, so it's not a test, it's a demo. So I do not have no assertion if this works or not. It's just, I have to watch the logs, and here in the logs we have an exception. And and here we also see like the select for update somewhere. Here we have select for update for this rental, and here we finally have the data changed exception. So it's not an optimistic lock exception or something. It's called data changed exception from jOOQ, and this is why I had this concurrent access. Speaking about exceptions, jOOQ has also an exception hierarchy like Spring Data. So it has the topmost exception is data access exception, and below you have these types here, like the data changed exception or a mapping exception or something like that. Now for the last few minutes, I want to talk to you about jOOQ and JPA. Because very often I see that companies are using Hibernate. They just choose it because we use Hibernate. There's mostly no reason to use Hibernate in the first place, but people are just doing that. And I often come to projects and say, hey, could improve your code because your queries are not good. You know, one thing that I really like is this nested structure with multiset. And very often people are using Hibernate for that, and then they need to be aware of the lazy fetching problem. Some of them are using the open session in view anti-pattern that you shouldn't use. So if you don't want to use that, what you have to do is to use entity graphs or join fetch. But this results in ugly stuff, right? And so often I introduce jOOQ in projects to say, hey, I have something better for you to read-only data. You shouldn't use Hibernate to read-only data. I mean, there's the stateless session from Hibernate, but this is hidden behind JPA, so no one knows about that. But what you can do is you can use jOOQ with Hibernate as well. And you can use jOOQ to create queries. That means even if you want to return entities, you can do that. So here I have entities. Here I have created a film, and the film has many-to-many relation to category, and we have a category entity that has a relation to films. Right, so that's the model. The difference here is I don't have an object for the intermediate table, the film category, because I don't need that. And now I want to read films, but with jOOQ. How should I do that? And this time I don't want to have records as a result, I want to have entities as a result. And this works because you can create a query. So this is just a simple query. You could have any complex query, but instead of executing it, you can just say get SQL. And it will also use prepared statements. It depends how you would do that. You could call get inline, and then it will inline the parameters, or you can use it like that, and then you get the prepared statement. And then I can go ahead and say, hey, entity manager, here's a native query. As a result, I like to have category entities, and I'm done. So if I run that, I will get JPA entities, despite I have used jOOQ. Doesn't matter. So here you see that the query is executed. Do we see the query? Now I'm curious. We don't see the query because I didn't enable Hibernate logging, but I can do that to prove. So I would have to enable some logging. Oops. And run it again, and now we should see the SQL statement. So that will be the proof that the query is not executed by jOOQ, but by Hibernate. And as it is Hibernate, you see we have an n+1 select problem made right away with this query, so probably not a good idea. But what I want to say is you could go ahead and say, I want to use Hibernate because I like the way Hibernate works with this entity state transition. I want to use that because I want to have cascading deletion, cascading updating. I want to have orphan removal. So the good is of Hibernate I like, but for querying maybe there's a better way. And that's the way you can do that. You can use jOOQ to create the SQL statement and have Hibernate execute it, and then it will be mapped. Now we have a problem because with that it's not so good. Huh? So, but we wouldn't do that anyway, right? Because this is happening because I'm logging the categories in the test. Otherwise, it wouldn't produce this n+1 select problem. Okay, now we have a few minutes left. Let's see what we have. Yes, finally. Here it's only written exporting data, but you can also import data with jOOQ. What does this mean? I can use jOOQ to export data in these formats. So I can directly export it to XML, CSV, JSON, HTML, text, and even charts. So this will be ASCII charts, not any nice charting library. It's just for fun, I would say. But sometimes this is very handy if you want to export data, and you can create just a statement and export the data. You don't need tool, because I could use IntelliJ and do a query and then export it to whatever format, but jOOQ can do that as well. So that means I can have a fetch and then finally say format CSV. That's all that I have to do. I could even add some parameters here. For example, I could define, I have to check how it works, I don't know. This will produce comma-separated values, but at least in Switzerland we use semicolon to separate values, not commas, so I should change that here. But what what jOOQ does is creating a CSV file. So this is the result of that. For sure it has, as the header here, it has the database column names, because it doesn't know what names that I would use. I could also use, for example, JSON. Let's see what JSON does. Yeah, JSON looks like that. So JSON can also be configured how it should work. Here it just prints fields and then table, and so it really dumps the database, as you can see. So it even adds metadata to the JSON data, what is exported, and the data here is somewhere else. So that's the field, and here it starts. So that's the records, and these is JSON without keys, so just the values. But I can create other types, whatever I like to do. And the same you can do for importing data. So in the demo source code, you will find import-export, I think. Yes, import-export. And here you see an import. So here we're importing data from CSV. There's a load method on the DSL where I can define where to load data to. There's some configuration. And then I can pass in the data. So this is a string, but I could also load the data from a file, define the fields, ignore the first row, stuff like that. And this is really, really, really handy, because if you are doing tests, for example, you could go ahead and write your tests like this and just let jOOQ import the data here. And finally, so the last thing that I want to mention, because this is not here, right, is store procedures. Who of you has to use store procedures? Are there any people? Do you like it? I like it, because sometimes it's great, because it will not transfer data from the database to your application server just to do some processing. So often it's it's better for the performance to do some stuff in the database. But using store procedures with JDBC, with callable statement, is not good. And if we have a look what this store procedure does, we will find it here. We have this film in stock and this film in stock, or film not in stock. Doesn't matter which one we take. This does just the simple select statement. It's just for convenience that we don't have to run the SQL query. So it also helps to build an API around your database, for example, if you're using functions or procedures. Now, how we can do that with jOOQ? jOOQ generates classes for you. So under routines, you will find this inventory in stock. And this inventory in stock is an abstract routine and has some parameters, because we have input and output parameters, sometimes in and out parameters. And now we have a class. So we have a class that has the exact same name as the store procedure in the database. And so the only thing that we need to do is we need to call it. So here in that case, I can directly call inventory in stock. So where does this come from? It also creates a class called routines, and there you have the functions. And the functions are here, in that case, static methods. And the only thing that you have to pass in as a first parameter is the configuration. So you need the DSL context, get the configuration from it, because there is the connection information, or the connection is there. and then you can pass parameters on and you will get back the data. Or you can use your self-made functions also in select statements, because it's a function in that case. And I have another project, maybe I can show that to finish it, where we have a lot of store procedures. And let me see if I find one. That's not a good one. Here we have one. Is this a very close? Here we have one. So here we have something else. This TA map record is a user-defined type. It's naming convention of my customer. That means it's a TA stands for table. So it's a table value type. And it's used as a map. And it has some methods. You can't see it really here. And it has a record. Oh, sorry. And here I'm creating elements of this TA map record in that test. And here I have a method. So that's Oracle. Oracle organizes store procedures into packages. So that means for every package in the database, it creates also a class with the store procedure that you can execute. Here I need the configuration. Here I put some input parameters. And finally here I put this table structure. And finally I execute it and get a field called where clause as string back as the result. So if you have a lot, and they have a lot, they have around 5,000 of these. Let me check where they are. Maybe here, you can see that. No, I can't show you because I don't have the source code. That was another question about in the break. In my example, I generate the jOOQ code every time I build the application. Here we have 2,000 tables and views and 5,000 store procedures plus some user-defined types. This will generate 8,000 Java classes. And compiling 8,000 Java classes requires some time, so I can't do that. What we have done, we have a separate build pipeline that is triggered when the database is changed. They have a special mechanism to update the database, but this triggers also the pipeline and generates a new version, and finally it updates the POM file of the application with the new version of the jOOQ generated code, and then we have the new version in our code. That's something that you have to think about. If you have really a huge database model, then it takes too much time. You can't do that. We also can't use Lickybase or Flyway scripts for that purpose because, or we can use that, but we have to do a baseline. Because what I've done as a mistake, for example, in the past is never take baseline from the Lickybase or Flyway script. So if you work on a project for a few years, suddenly you have 100, 1,000 Flyway scripts, and this takes forever if you run tests to execute all the statements. So you have to find a way how to reduce them over time, right? And that's the way. But just to finish that with store procedure, it's very, very easy to use store procedures. And it doesn't matter if the code is in Java or in store procedure, because you can call it like it was a Java method. So we have 2 minutes. And I think that's it. So if you like my talk, you will also find more material on martinelli.ch. I will have another talk tomorrow about whether you should use Hibernate or jOOQ, but it's up to you if you want to come or not, because it's more or less the same content, just in 50 minutes instead of 3 hours. Are there any questions left? Yes.
You showed a stream example earlier.
Yeah.
Is the stream lazily populated, or is all the data fetched in one go?
That depends. It depends. The question was, is the stream lazy fetched or not? If you use it like that, I would say it's not lazy fetched. Yeah.
Batch updates and
Yes, yes. The question was, is batching supported with updates or deletes or inserts? Yes, for sure. You can define the batch size. You can create a batch. I would say we have an example I can show you. Wait a minute. Here we have... that's the wrong project. I would say there is one. Batch test, yes. So here we see it. You have this DSL batched method where you also have a lambda to pass, and then you can do inside whatever you want, or you can batch manually or do whatever. Yeah. jOOQ has, I would say jOOQ is more or less feature complete in terms of what you can do with the database. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. So I hope you liked it, and maybe see you tomorrow. Have a nice rest of your conference.